When we first start doing the research of our ancestors in cemeteries, we think of them at a graveyard, laid out in neat little rows with everyone clearly marked and the headstones intact and upright. And often when we go back and earlier in time, we get tripped up and run into brick walls because our ancestors aren't next to churches and aren't laid out into neat rows with everybody marked so clearly. They were often buried in family plots on the family property with just a few family members close together. These small plots can be hard to locate, especially in rural areas, and maybe even modern life kind of made those places disappear. This is Denise Allen with Your Pennsylvania Ancestors, and in this episode, I hope I can help you get inspired to go visit that cemetery over the holidays. In this time of COVID, it's a safe thing that we can do and really experience our ancestors. I interviewed Lara Thomas with the Berks County Association for Graveyard Preservation. Her group works with these tiny cemeteries, these rural places with just those few headstones, and it works to catalog and preserve those for future generations. I hope this episode gives you some information on how to find your ancestors, some tips on preservation, and inspires you to connect with the history of your ancestors through their gravestones. Welcome to Your Pennsylvania Ancestors with Denise Allen. Lara Thomas, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited that you're here because as genealogists, we're always trying to find the cemeteries of our ancestors. And you are a part of an organization that helps preserve these cemeteries for people. So can you tell us a little bit about like how you got started and what your role is in BCAP?
Yeah, Berks County Association for Graveyard Preservation is a 501c3. We're a nonprofit organization. We don't necessarily have a headquarters because we're all volunteers. We tend to usually meet with COVID, we're meeting underneath a pavilion in Ole. But a good portion of our time spent together is preserving historic burial grounds that have either been abandoned, orphaned, or we have a few that they've been dissolved church graveyards, for if you think of it that way. Either the church dissolved long ago and there's no other parent organization that's taking care of it, nor family members or anyone else that can keep an eye on it. So we try. But there are, at last count, over 300 cemeteries that meet that category in Berks County alone.
Oh, wow.
Our organization usually runs about 15 members, and then we have a lot of volunteers. So obviously we can't hit all of those. We hit on a semi-regular basis or keep an eye on approximately 100 to 120 of those. And when I say keep an eye on or maintain, that might mean we get to the cemetery once every 1 to 3 years. And we go through, we look at the structural integrity, we look at what impact might be coming up on it in terms of where the property is located, what's the access, what are the rights of access, does it have its own deed, has that changed? And then we also look at the actual cemetery itself. A lot of the small historic private cemeteries, then most people can picture in their mind they're driving down a highway or driving on a back road and they see that one tiny little plot in the middle of a farmer's field, usually surrounded by a stone wall, and if not a stone wall, a couple of trees. And you're like, what the heck is that out there? Yeah, that's somebody's cemetery that existed usually, especially in Berks County, because the people that were settling were doing so and needed a place to bury their family, and the churches weren't established yet. Berks County was formed out of Philadelphia County, as many of your genealogists probably know, and we are one of the older counties. We do have, a lot of people that have deeds that go all the way back to the Penns, and that makes things interesting. But it also means that a lot of those cemeteries have now been orphaned. Times weren't always the way they are now. There were times where farmers needed every square inch. So they picked up the tombstones, and if we're lucky, they put them in the barn. If we're not lucky, there's no record of them. We just know from somebody saying, well, my grandfather said there used to be a cemetery somewhere out there. there's no way that we can work on that beyond that. But we have about 120 that do have monuments, either a memorial or an actual gravestone still there that we try to keep an eye on. We try to maintain any border walls that are established if we can. And let me tell you, that's a big part of where our money goes, because it's extremely expensive to try to keep stone and mortar wall that is anywhere from 100 to almost 300 years old in working condition when it's in the middle of housing development, and it's in the middle of a farmer's field, when it has a pipeline that wants to go nearby. We've been very lucky because the organization reaches out. We've been able to work with a lot of the major utility companies and get them to either go around or work with us. And we've even had donations from some, which is awesome. But a big part of our work is trying to keep them from getting any worse off. I'll be honest, I think I'm I know I am the youngest board member. And there aren't a whole lot of other younger members either. So it's a physical challenge sometimes. Unfortunately, people often don't appreciate some of that stuff until we get a little bit later in life. Yeah. But we do what we can.
Yeah. So who were the angels? I mean, and started this organization? I mean, because really, it's unlikely they had a direct person that they knew that was buried in one of these plots.
Actually, it was.
Oh, it was.
That's how it actually started. Okay. Jackie Nine, back in the late 80s and early 90s, as well as Laurel Miller, were two Berks County residents that had a passion and an interest in genealogy. And Jackie was working on tracking down 9 ancestors. There's some related to Bertolettes. So your ancestry people out there and genealogists probably recognize those names, especially in Pennsylvania. And this part of Pennsylvania, we have a lot of French Huguenots. So we get the Bertolettes and things like that in. And she was doing research and trying to track them down. There were some books out there, nothing recent. There was a book, I think written in the 30s, that was briefly published. It's only about 30 years old, 30 pages long. And it mentioned a few, and that was enough to get people's interest started. And Jackie got together, and once she realized and started to find some 9 graves, she was a woman with a mission. She made it her life's work. She got together with Laurel and a couple other ladies, got the organization started officially in 1994. Even before it was official, as of 1992, they put together a book that functions as our handbook. It's called Epitaphs. It's no longer in print, but some of your readers and members probably have heard of it. And it is a record that of every private cemetery and historic cemetery that they could find and get access to. Access is another issue. Some of the folks from the area might remember that even made media that small private cemetery had the land around it bought, and the new homeowner was refusing access to family members not that long ago. I'm not going to name names because it gets not nice.
Right.
And that's always a challenge. We work and educate people on the laws that have been passed, especially 1994 Act for protecting historic cemeteries. We have members who are very good at researching the deeds and going back to provenance and working with the Planetary and the Department of Wills and all kinds of stuff to make sure that the cemeteries that are there, we know when we can get at them, how we can get at them. We find out who owns the property around them now, because obviously we want a good relationship with them. And for the most part, that people are great. They see that cemetery, it's more than what they can handle, and they don't want to see it get worse either. We actually have a young gentleman just recently, no relationship to historic German settlers in the area. And he bought the house and found out that part of his yard bordered and was surrounding a small historic cemetery. He reached out to us. He's like, this looks awful. I'm trying to keep it mowed and keeps it decent, but I need help. And he reached out to us, and we've gone out and we're going to do some training, show people how to rebuild a fieldstone wall, a dry wall. And we're going to try to clean up the tombstones and get it so at least he could get in there with a regular push mower if he needs to. So
that's
when Jackie passed, a good portion of her estate created a trust. That's the 9 Trust. And we are grateful beneficiaries of funds that come through there. If it weren't for them, we couldn't do a lot of what we do. It can cost anywhere from $10,000 and $40,000 to fix up one of these walls. And if we don't fix the wall, then we worry about what happens to the stones. There needs to be something that protects them so that the elements and people don't just, trample right over it. We do have a stonemason on our board who is active, and he helps us with all of that and does some work with helping us get stones put back in place properly. Anybody that's ever gone by a cemetery has certainly seen tombstones, especially aged ones that are tipping, that are broken. So we also work on that. We try to get stones reset. We try to fix broken ones. There's one private cemetery in the Maiden Creek area where unfortunately teenagers went through and destroyed all the stones, just picked them up and threw them and smashed them into pieces. And our board members and some volunteers spent, I think it was over a year and a half, putting them back together like a jigsaw puzzle. And trying to find as many pieces as possible and had them reset in special, almost museum quality boxes, so that at least they're together and preserved. And if someone needs to go and find them, they can look at them and they are readable for the most part. But we can't get some of that back.
Yeah. I'm completely stunned and amazed at the amount of work that I think I didn't realize the scope when you said 300 of these independent cemeteries. And it makes sense. Yeah. Because there wasn't a church established. The minister traveled. People needed to be buried. People buried their families together. And I'm really wondering, do you know of any other organizations similar to yours in the adjoining counties, like in Lancaster or York?
Not really. We know of some family associations.
Okay.
Sometimes Hottenstein is a name that probably especially Berks County people are familiar with. The Hottenstein family, has their own private organization and trust that they try to take care of their private cemetery. The Reber has family members and distant family members that all support, and they work at fundraising and then pass those funds on to us so that we can use the stonemason and do work on theirs. Kime is another one that comes to mind. One that's just in its infancy and getting started and was kind of got its attention because of the modern issues with warehouses is the Kemp in Maxitawny Township. We're lucky enough that we've gotten some media attention. We're lucky enough that there are some family members and residents in the area that have found out that there is intent or interest in putting a warehouse that would cause the entire private cemetery to have to be picked up and moved. Because it's a historic cemetery and it is registered, it requires court action to be able to do that. And they've gotten pretty far with that, because you have to be able to prove that there aren't family members. Well, you got to ask first too, and a lot of people don't realize that this is what could be happening with small private cemeteries. So we've been working with local people, family members, descendants of the Kemp, and trying to get some attention to this, so that we know for a fact that there is one Revolutionary War veteran there. And one of the other things we've been doing is tracing the genealogy and helping family members and other genealogists determine who else is there. The cemetery itself, for example, the Kemp, goes back to about 1730. It was started by a German who came here, and his son, that was the first child born here in the Americas, is known because it's George Kemp. He was a captain in the Revolutionary Army. He was also appointed a squire. In other words, he was an esquire. In those days, it was the closest thing to a justice of a peace and a judge all wrapped up in one, because there were no people that were graduated as lawyers. The Kemps intermarried with all of the big names in that part of the county, and what led to Kutztown and the founding of Kutztown University, the park in Kutztown, everything, that you can think of, all the way that things fall back together,
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. And if people wanted to follow the status of that case, what do you recommend? The Reading Eagle newspaper?
The Reading Eagle has been very kind to us, and we've gotten some attention that way. Let me find their Facebook page. They have a Facebook group, and they're trying to get people together to help support each other. And
okay, great. I'll put that in the show notes, because you never know where people ended up,
Yeah, because I'd have to go and dig for it real quick. Sorry.
A lot of these German families had 10, 12 kids.
Yeah.
Later on, obviously some of them moved out of the state.
And I think in some degrees, we're lucky. The genealogy is a little easier for us in this area because the Germans are anal. They like to keep records. a lot of the traveling pastors kept good records, which helps a lot too. Here we go. Maxitani warehouses at Hottenstein Road. Maxitani warehouses at Hottenstein Road.
Okay.
That's one of the ones that's following to try to help preserve the camp and the area around it.
Okay, great.
But yeah, if it weren't for that, and that's part of what we do too, we go and we search out pastoral records, we search out family wills, and we try to build provenance for the cemeteries so that there's support for what we believe is buried there. We're very lucky that Jackie Nine and Laura Miller did that book in 94, 92. And then there was another one prior that they did that wasn't quite as big, and they did a transcription of every cemetery they could get to. That's a lot. That's a lot of transcription.
It's a lot. Yeah. And that book you said is out of print, but if people wanted to see what was in there.
Epitaphs.
Epitaphs. Okay.
By Jackie Nine, Laurel Miller.
Okay.
Yeah.
You don't have a copy for sale on your website or something?
I wish, but because it's out of print and we didn't hold the copyright. No.
Oh, okay.
But if you come talk to us, we're happy to loan people pages or get, we're a small organization. Come ask us. We'll let you borrow it. Take a look.
Okay, that's great.
I've already taken, the little snippets of each cemetery to family members that as they need it.
Okay.
Because it is so old, we are discovering errors ourselves every now and then. There was an acceptance of dowsing that not everyone might not find acceptable. If you're not familiar with dowsing, it is a folk tradition that is followed by people even looking for water to drill a well, but it can also be used to locate a grave or to locate the boundaries of a cemetery. That doesn't exactly hold up in court, when it comes to determining how many people are buried in a cemetery.
Right.
But yeah.
I love it. So I hate to ask this question, but do you have any idea how many cemeteries might have been lost and, like you said, like maybe plowed over and the farmer used the field?
Over 100.
Oh, before the organization formed?
Oh, yeah. Because even when they went around in the 90s, there were quite a few that it was just word of mouth. And we have that recorded. If anybody reaches out to us and has a family name, we can cross-reference it with the ones that we're aware of. And we can also tell you whether or not, if there's any monuments still standing.
Okay.
Or any memorials that still exist. We constantly fight the environment as well as the human condition in preserving the stones that do exist. We stay up to date. In fact, two of us, the one vice president and myself, Carla Hummel, and I went to a presentation in Newark, Delaware with a world-renowned preservationist and conservationist, Jonathan Appel. And he's actually the gentleman that did work on the Knight's Tomb in colonial Jamestown. They brought him in to rehabilitate that tombstone, which had action taken to it over 300 years. And he basically reassembled the pieces and helped conserve and preserve it. And so we went to a workshop of his so that what we do, even for the small cemeteries in our area, we try to stay on top of it to the best of our abilities. What materials are acceptable? What materials aren't going to harm the stones further? For example, we have a biocide that we can use that helps remove lichens and moss without damaging the stone. Different things that we can do for stuff like that. And anytime people ask, we're happy to offer advice. Sometimes you can love a cemetery too much. Don't go weed trimming in it every week, right up against the stone. Trimmers are really hazardous, those old delicate stones. Don't use Roundup and other chemical agents to try to kill the weeds around your stone. These stones are so old, and stones are a natural material. They're porous, whether we believe it or not, and they suck up all the chemicals out of the soil, and it causes the stones to break apart even more. So there's just lots of little tips that we can give people to help, things like that.
Those are great tips. Those are really great tips. In terms of tips, what tips do you have for genealogists that are trying to navigate their way maybe through some of these old cemeteries? Because everyone's desperate to find that record of death, in the 1700s or early 1800s.
Mm-hmm. If you're lucky enough to find a will, a lot of times they do mention private cemeteries and them being set aside to my descendants and shall be maintained, blah, blah, blah. And that gives you a clue to go looking for one. Just before this Zoom call, Carla and I were looking at an 1872 map of Berks County. working on proving or disproving the theory of whether or not a private cemetery was located on a particular farm. We had somebody's word of mouth saying there was, but if we go back to these maps, a lot of times we can see the small private cemeteries because they did have value back then. Even in the 1840s, the 1870s, they were accepted and usual practice to bury people in small private cemeteries. So they made it onto the atlases and maps, which is a big help. If you're doing research and you think that that's a possibility, don't be afraid to pull out the maps and start looking, especially if your ancestor might have been in a rural area, because that's a big help.
That's a great idea because there weren't names for all the roads, you
No.
know, I mean,
Mm-mm.
and the
And
roads
they've changed.
were dirt.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
And borders have changed.
right.
You know, what is Berks County now and what is Northampton County now and Lehigh County, those lines have shifted a lot.
Yes.
There's a lot of small churches and private cemeteries that at one point were Berks County that are now Lehigh or Northampton and vice versa. So that happens too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, how can people support your work? Because there's people listening to this podcast from all over the United States, and I'm sure people, yay, and people who can trace their ancestors back to Berks County and want to know that someone's taking care of that resting place for them and that it's not going to go away. So when they get here in 5 years, I hope it's not 5 years till we can travel again, but you know, whenever they get back here to visit and actually see, you know, their past here in Pennsylvania. But people want to support your work. So how do they get in touch with you? What can they do to support you and what you do?
We have our own website. If you enter, it's BCAGP.org. And there is a great tool even for anyone that's doing research as well as who wants to support us. We have a listing of a lot of our cemeteries directly accessible through there. We have pictures that we've taken of graves in the various cemeteries. We also have newsletters that we issue quarterly. To save costs, and this is the modern age, we currently issue 2 quarters that are as an e-edition and 2 quarters that go out in print as well as e-edition. And you can access any of our past newsletters, which feature articles on work that we've been doing or cemeteries that we've discovered or cemeteries that we're working on restoring. And there is also an index and archive there so that you can try to search for the ones that you might need. We're also on Facebook. You can follow and see the work we did. Just last weekend, we were out. We did 2 cemeteries that we thought were going to be in reasonably good shape, but due to COVID, we've lost a lot of our volunteers. For example, Youth Day of Caring normally takes place in the spring, and a local high school FFA is very supportive, and they usually lend us anywhere between 20 and 40 teenagers who are skilled with using weed trimmers and axes if necessary and all sorts of good stuff. And they come out and we get 20 cemeteries done in one day. That makes a huge difference for us. We didn't have that this year. So we're behind the gun. If you're in the area and you're physically interested in helping us, let us know. We are taking COVID precautions. So we're making sure we're spread out and not having as many people come to any of our work days. But if you're physically able, we encourage it. We also encourage people to adopt a cemetery. If you find that you are related to some of the people in there, we have helped people get even just loose groupings together of support. We just did that with one recently. New homeowners didn't realize that the cemetery didn't have anybody. And by the time she was done talking with us, I think she's had at least 8 houses that were ready to band together to help take care of that cemetery. That makes a big difference for us. It really does.
Wonderful.
It does.
They're being stewards of that little piece of history that they have, you know, it's just this little tiny sliver.
Yes.
And maybe they'll do some research and genealogy on this.
Yep. You can become a member. Our fees aren't great. You know, they're very small. Please, you know, contributions obviously are tax deductible. We are happy to accept monetary deductions, but we, you know, physical help helps too.
That's
wonderful. It makes a big difference.
Well, I really hope people do reach out and they follow your work on Facebook. They join as a member, you know, come out if they're local and weed whack and be those eyeballs on the stones and make sure everybody's well taken care of in the past. We don't want to forget those folks.
Yep. BCAGP.org. It's going to have links to lots of good stuff. It'll have the newsletters. It'll have names of a lot of the cemeteries that we have records on. And it also has contact information for myself as well as the other officers of the board. And reach us by email or phone, and we're happy to share with you what we have.
Well, thank you, Laura Thomas, for being on the podcast and sharing all the great preservation efforts going on here in Berks County. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate you helping spread the word.
Thank you again to Laura Thomas for filling us in on how to preserve these headstones, how to find them, and I hope this gave you some tips and resources to do your research, especially those early ancestors in the rural counties of Pennsylvania. The work of BCAGP is so worthwhile, and I hope you find an organization like that in the counties where you're doing your research, or at least those historical and genealogical societies which could have information on your ancestors. In this time of COVID, and especially with the holidays, visiting a cemetery, especially these tiny rural ones, or even the ones at churches like the one I'm standing at right now, could be a way for you to do that genealogy research and also just kind of get out of the house, get some sunshine, and enjoy some connection to the past. Make sure you check out my other episodes to help your research, and give me a subscribe, a like, a follow, so you don't miss the next episodes. In next week's episode, we'll do urban cemeteries with Mount Moriah Cemetery, the largest cemetery in Pennsylvania, and that one's located in Philadelphia. I wish you many discoveries of your Pennsylvania ancestors.